don't make us go back.
You're safe now. I promise.
A storm pounds the Maine coast as Adrian Westcott, a strikingly handsome CEO, fingers a Navy Silver Coast Guard coin and turns into his clifftop estate. At the iron anchor gates, an 8-year-old shields his toddler brother under a torn tarp. "Please, don't send us back to the boat," he whispers. Adrian feels his lost brother's storm rise. If he opens the gate, what truth will the coin uncover, and can he keep his promise this time? The storm warnings had rolled across the Maine coast all afternoon, but Adrian Westcott stayed at the window of his Portland office until the glass began to rattle. Below him, cranes lined the windport like tall, patient sentries. Tug horns carried through the sleet. He looked like the magazines always described him, the striking CEO with deep blue eyes and dark brown hair brushed to the side, gray threaded in with quiet authority. The navy suit fit his tall, muscular frame as if the tailor knew the way he stood when he hid pain. White shirt, red tie, a warm, confident smile that rarely reached his chest. On the desk lay a Navy and Silver Coast Guard Challenge coin. He reached for it as the sky went slate. The coin had belonged to his younger brother, Mark, a pilot who never came back from a winter rescue. The crash had taken Mark and Emily, Adrian's fiancée, whose laughter still lived in the corners of his house like a song he could not turn off. He had not answered his phone that night. A meeting. 2 hours late to a promise. He carried that delay in his pocket with the coin. Adrian turned from the window. He checked the weather screen again. Nor'easter intensifying. He should have left earlier. On the wall, a framed photo showed Mark's helicopter lifting from a cutter's deck, rotors blurring the sea to spray. Beneath it, Emily, in a wool coat and long scarf, smiling at him from a different December. He let his thumb rise and fall along the coin's ridged edge. "Come home before the storm," she always said. He had learned how to arrive to empty rooms. His phone buzzed. Elena, the house manager. "Heat's on, sir. Generator is ready. Soup on the stove. The cliff road is icing." "Thank you, Elena. I'm on my way." His voice sounded steady, as if steadiness could be willed into being. He slid the coin into his palm again, a small anchor in the gale. The elevator carried him to the garage. He drove himself, as always, headlights slicing through dense, glassy sleet. Downtown lights fell away behind him, replaced by the black seam of a shoreline road. To the left, the Atlantic roared. To the right, pines leaned under ice, their branches snapping like distant knuckles. His company moved nacelles and blades through these waters, threading weather windows and tides. Schedules had become the way he controlled what could not be controlled. If you planned tight enough, maybe nothing else would break. But grief never stayed on schedule. It arrived like weather, and it took what it wanted. He had tried to outwork it. He had tried to outgive it, funding scholarships in Mark's name, rebuilding docks after storms, sitting at the edge of hospitals where the ocean finally let go of someone. At night, in that house on the cliff, he returned to rooms so clean they could have been a museum. No scuffed shoes by the door, no cereal left in bowls. No one to say, "You're late, but I saved your favorite." Sleet hammered the windshield. He eased the SUV along the final curve, tires crunching over a white sheen. Up ahead, beyond a stand of wind-bent spruce, the iron anchor gates of his estate stood against the sky, black and stubborn. Emily had teased him about those gates. "You live on a cliff, in a fortress, and still you build a moat," she'd said. He had told her the anchors suited the place. What he had not admitted was that the gates kept him from drifting back to the night he could not change. He slowed near the intercom pillar. The security camera blinked, its tiny green light fighting snow. Wind scraped the ironwork with a sound like a distant bow across a cello string. He rolled the window down and the cold rushed in, tasting of salt and copper. He rubbed the coin with his thumb and forefinger, feeling the embossed crest. He spoke aloud to no one, or to the person he was when Mark still called him brother. "I'm here," he said. The words fogged in the air. "I came home." The wipers swept hard. For a second, the glass cleared. At the base of the gates, near where the anchors crossed, something fluttered. A dark shape pressed low to the snow, more shadow than object. The wind shifted, and the shape stilled, then trembled, as if holding itself smaller against the iron. Adrian's hand hovered over the gate remote, the coin warm in his fist. He leaned closer, listening to the storm. Some stories begin with thunder and the sound of a key turning. Some begin at a gate. If you believe in second chances, stay with me. Snow slashed sideways as Adrian idled at the iron anchor gates, trying to make sense of the dark shapes crouched low to the ground. The headlights cut through the sleet, revealing two small figures pressed against the frozen bars. His pulse kicked, though he didn't know why yet. He stepped out, the storm immediately clawing at his suit, his shoes slipping on the icy pavement. The shapes shifted. One lifted its head. A boy, maybe 8, eyes wide and hollow, shielding something smaller under a torn tarp. Adrian crouched, the snow soaking through his navy pants. The child's lips trembled as he spoke. "Please, don't send us back to the boat." His voice was raw, barely carried over the wind. Adrian froze. He looked under the boy's arm and saw a toddler, maybe 2 years old, cheeks blue, lashes clumped with ice. The older boy had wrapped him in what looked like a ripped blanket, but it was soaked through. The toddler's chest rose shallowly, each breath a fragile protest against the cold. Adrian reached instinctively, but the older boy flinched. His arms tightened protectively around his brother. "We'll be quiet, I swear. Just don't make us go back." His eyes were fierce despite the tremor. The words cut deeper than the wind. Adrian's own voice caught in his throat. He tugged his coat off, wrapping it around both boys. "You're safe," he said, steady though his heart raced. "I'm not sending you anywhere." The older boy studied him as if searching for cracks in the promise. Only when Adrian lifted the toddler carefully into his arms did the boy relent. Though he stayed close, one small hand gripping Adrian's sleeve like an anchor. He bundled them into the SUV, heat blasting as he sped toward the clifftop mansion. The toddler whimpered softly, eyes barely opening, while the older boy whispered reassurances in his ear, words too quiet to catch. Inside the grand foyer, the contrast was brutal. Marble floors, chandeliers glowing, warmth pushing against the storm. Adrian carried the toddler upstairs, Elena rushing from the kitchen at the sound of the door. "Who are they?" she asked, shock plain on her face. "Children," Adrian said, breathless. "Found at the gates. Get blankets. Call Dr. Patel." Elena obeyed without another word. The older boy hovered by the door, hesitant, dripping snow. His gaze flicked from the high ceilings to the staircase, suspicious of wealth, unsure if this place was safer than the cold. Adrian knelt in front of him. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy whispered. His hand brushed the toddler's damp hair. "That's Noah." Adrian nodded. "Ethan, Noah needs help. So do you. No one's sending you back tonight. Do you trust me enough to stay?" Ethan didn't answer, but he stepped forward, one cautious foot at a time, until he was beside Adrian on the rug. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting light across their faces. Later, when Dr. Patel arrived, the boys were examined and stabilized. Ethan clutched a cup of warm broth, silent, eyes darting everywhere. When a box of crayons was set in front of him, he took them without a word and began to draw on the paper placemat. Adrian, standing nearby, watched as shapes emerged. Lines of hallways, barred doors, jagged strokes of black forming an anchor slashed through the middle. Adrian's stomach turned. He knew that symbol. The storm raged outside. Inside, a mystery had crossed his gate and taken root in his home. At the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed, sterile and too bright after the storm. Adrian sat by the boy's gurney as the nurses wrapped Noah in warming blankets and placed him under gentle heat lamps. Ethan stayed stiff, perched on the chair beside his brother, crayons clutched in his hand like weapons. A nurse offered him a teddy bear, but Ethan pushed it aside and began drawing again on the hospital chart paper. The lines were jagged, certain. Hallways, doorways with slashes across them. He shaded in small squares, like barred windows. And in the center, he pressed the crayon so hard it snapped. A black anchor with a slash running through its stem. Adrian's breath caught. He leaned closer, the ridged Coast Guard coin warm in his pocket. He had seen that emblem before. Years back, whispers had carried through seafaring circles, crews that branded gear with marks, half warning, half ownership. The slashed anchor was one he'd heard in dockside taverns, tied to men who bent the desperate into labor. Families, children, people no one would miss. Adrian cleared his throat gently. "Ethan, what is this?" The boy's eyes flicked up, guarded, then back to the page. He didn't speak. Adrian tried again. "Did you see this on the boat?" Ethan shook his head fast, gripping the crayon tighter. His little brother whimpered in his sleep, and Ethan bent low to soothe him. "It's where they keep us," he muttered, almost too quiet to catch. Adrian's stomach tightened. "Who keeps you?" Silence. Only the scratching of crayon on paper as Ethan added thick doors to his drawing. When Adrian reached a careful hand to point at the anchor, Ethan recoiled. "You'll leave too," he whispered fiercely. "Everyone leaves." The words hit harder than the storm. Adrian thought of Mark, of Emily, of his own cowardice the night he'd chosen work over them. Guilt churned. He wanted to promise he wouldn't leave, but he knew words alone meant nothing to a child who had seen only broken promises. A doctor entered, chart in hand. "They'll be all right for now. The little one needs fluids and monitoring, but you got them here in time." She glanced at Adrian, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Are you their guardian?" Adrian hesitated, staring at Ethan clutching the broken crayon. Guardian. The word carried more weight than his fortune ever had. "For tonight, yes," he said quietly. "For tonight, I am." Ethan's hand stilled. His eyes lifted, doubtful but listening. Adrian pulled the challenge coin from his pocket, set it on the side table where the boy could see it. "My brother carried this," he said softly. "He flew into storms to save people he didn't know. He told me, if you find someone in need, you don't walk away." Ethan glanced at the coin, then back to his drawing. He didn't speak, but the lines on the page softened. Instead of more bars, he sketched waves, blue crayon swirling across the bottom of the map. Adrian exhaled slowly. Something had shifted. A small door opening. The storm outside battered the hospital windows, relentless. But inside, beneath the hum of machines and the rustle of crayon on paper, Adrian understood. This was no accident. 2 boys had appeared at his gate, carrying a story etched in fear and anchors. And now, it was his story too. The hospital quieted after midnight. The storm pressed against the glass, but in the pediatric wing, only the soft beeps of monitors and the shuffle of nurses filled the air. Adrian stood at the doorway to Ethan and Noah's room, his coat draped over a chair, the Coast Guard coin resting heavy in his hand. Ethan sat upright in bed, his knees pulled close, a blanket around his shoulders. He hadn't slept, not even after the doctors assured him Noah was stable. Crayon marks still stained his fingertips. He eyed Adrian warily, as if expecting him to vanish once the storm passed. Adrian stepped inside, pulling the chair closer. "You did well tonight, Ethan. You kept your brother alive." Ethan's gaze flicked to Noah, then back down to the floor. "Had to. No one else will." Adrian leaned forward. "What about your mom?" The boy's lips tightened. He traced a finger along the edge of the blanket, silent. When Adrian thought he wouldn't answer, Ethan whispered, "They took her." Adrian's chest clenched. "Who?" "Men with dogs and boats," Ethan said, voice breaking on the words. "They came at night. Said she owed them. She screamed when they dragged her. I hid Noah under the nets." His eyes watered, but he blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. "Everyone leaves," he muttered again, almost to himself. Adrian swallowed. He thought of his brother's crash, of Emily's voice silenced in the same night. He had left, too, in his own way. Work had taken him away from the people who mattered most. The echo of that failure pressed heavy now. He set the coin on the bed rail, letting the light catch its navy and silver crest. My brother used to say storms test who we really are. When someone's lost, you don't turn back. You keep searching. Ethan stared at the coin, his face unreadable. Everyone says that. Then they leave anyway. The words cut deep. Adrian steadied his voice. I'm not leaving, Ethan. Not this time. For a long moment, the boy said nothing. Then, with small, hesitant fingers, he pushed the coin back toward Adrian. Prove it, he whispered. The challenge landed heavier than any boardroom demand. Adrian nodded, sliding the coin back into his pocket. I will. The door creaked open. A nurse poked her head in. Mr. Westcott, I know it's late, but visiting hours... They stay, Adrian interrupted firmly, his voice carrying a steel that silenced further protest. The nurse nodded quickly and closed the door. Adrian looked back at Ethan, who clutched the blanket tighter. The boy's shoulders eased the smallest bit, as if he'd been waiting to see if Adrian would fight for him, even in this small way. He reached out, not touching, but resting his hand on the edge of the mattress. Rest, Ethan. I'll be here when you wake up. Ethan's eyes fluttered, exhaustion finally winning. He whispered something barely audible, maybe a thank you, maybe just Noah's name. Within minutes, both boys were asleep, their breathing even at last. Adrian sat back in the chair, the storm still raging outside. He stared at the coin in his palm, at the two small forms curled under hospital blankets, and at the dark window where his reflection met him with tired, haunted eyes. This time, he knew, walking away wasn't an option. By morning, the nor'easter had left Portland glazed in ice and silence. Adrian stood in the hospital cafeteria with a paper cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. He stared at the snow piled against the tall windows, mind circling Ethan's whispered words. Men with dogs and boats. He needed answers. Back upstairs, Ethan sat at the little desk in his room, crayons scattered like shrapnel. Noah slept soundly, clutching a worn plush whale with a blue ribbon tied around its tail. Ethan had drawn more overnight. Maps of twisting hallways, cold storage rooms, and again that slashed black anchor. Adrian didn't recognize every detail, but he knew enough to feel a knot forming in his gut. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. One name stopped him. Tessa Quinn. Tessa had served with his brother in the Coast Guard before becoming an analyst. Brilliant, meticulous, unafraid of storms, on the sea or in human behavior. If anyone could decipher what Ethan's drawings meant, it was her. He called. She answered with her clipped New England tone. Adrian, it's been a while. I need your eyes, he said. 2 kids turned up at my gate last night. They're talking about boats. Men, a mark I've seen before, a slashed anchor. A pause. Then, send me the drawings, and don't talk to anyone else until I see them. Within an hour, Tessa arrived at the hospital. Her blonde hair was pulled back, her coat still dusted with snow. She shook Ethan's hand with calm professionalism, then spread his drawings across a side table. She studied in silence. He's mapping a holding facility, she said at last. Barred doors, security dogs. This symbol, she tapped the slashed anchor, belongs to Caleb Drummond. Adrian frowned. Never heard of him. You wouldn't, Tessa said, her eyes sharp. Drummond runs a front called Harbor Light Renewal. Looks like a charity. Rehabilitation for dock workers, support for coastal families. But it's a shell. They recruit the desperate, then funnel them into forced labor. Kids included. The anchor mark is their stamp. If Ethan's seen it, then his mother may be trapped. Ethan lifted his head, eyes wary but hopeful. You know where she is? Tessa crouched to his level. Not yet, but your drawings help. You remember details most adults wouldn't. Adrian watched the boy's shoulders loosen slightly at the praise. He thought of Mark, how he used to calm panicked sailors with steady words in the middle of a storm. Ethan needed that same steadiness now. "What's our next step?" Adrian asked. Tessa spread another page across the table. "We cross-reference. If Harbor Light is moving families, they'll leave traces in payroll, doc manifests, nonprofit filings. We dig there first." Ethan looked from her to Adrian, suspicious again. "And then you'll leave? Once you know?" Adrian knelt beside him, pulling the challenge coin from his pocket. He let it gleam in the hospital light. "Not this time, Ethan. You said to prove it. I will." The boy's gaze lingered on the coin. He didn't nod, but he didn't turn away either. Outside, snow began to fall again, softer this time, as if the storm had shifted. Adrian straightened, determination hardening in his chest. He had spent years hiding behind walls of work and wealth, but now, staring at Ethan and Noah, two children who had no one left but him, he knew the walls had to come down. "Find Rosa Delgado," Adrian said quietly, using the mother's name for the first time, "and bring her home." Tessa spread folders across Adrian's mahogany desk later that night, her eyes sharp in the glow of the lamp. The cliff-top mansion felt less like a sanctuary now, and more like a command post. Outside, waves pounded the rocks, echoing the storm inside Adrian's chest. She slid one file toward him. Payroll from Harbor Light Renewal. Shell companies paying workers who never exist on paper. But this, she tapped a name. This is real. Rosa Delgado, dockside laborer, missing 2 weeks. Adrian's pulse quickened. He remembered Ethan's trembling voice. They took her. He clenched his brother's Coast Guard coin in his palm, its ridges biting his skin. Witnesses at the cold storage pier recall a dark-haired woman, Tessa continued. Matches the mother's description. She was seen near a fenced compound before she disappeared. Adrian glanced toward the living room where Ethan was building a tower of blocks, Noah toddling beside him. The sound of small voices, fragile, determined, cut through the emptiness of the house. He couldn't let them grow up believing everyone left. "Could she still be alive?" he asked. Tessa hesitated. "If she's in Drummond's system, yes. They don't waste able hands." The words chilled him. Rosa Delgado wasn't just missing. She was being used, controlled. Adrian turned back to Tessa. "We need proof, something undeniable." She nodded, sliding another folder open. "DNA testing. I took swabs from the boys at the hospital. They match Rosa Delgado in the state's missing persons database. These are her sons." The confirmation hit like a bell struck hard. He wasn't imagining the bond forming under his roof. The children weren't shadows or runaways. They were family torn apart. Adrian rose, pacing to the window where sleet traced lines down the glass. The mansion lights flickered faintly against the storm. He thought of Mark again, how his brother had flown into impossible weather because people were waiting on the other side. He had always said the same thing before strapping in. Someone has to go. "Why not me?" Adrian turned back, the coin warm against his fist. "Then it's my responsibility now." Tessa studied him carefully. "You're running a billion-dollar project, Adrian. Investors won't forgive distraction." "Let them wait," he said flatly. "I didn't save my brother. I didn't save Emily. I won't fail these boys or their mother." From the hallway, Ethan's voice carried softly. "Noah, careful. You'll knock it over." Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound steady him. When he opened them, his decision was firm. "We move on Drummond, quietly. No headlines yet. And when Rosa comes home, these boys will know someone stayed." Tessa nodded, but her expression was unreadable. "Then prepare yourself. Drummond plays for keeps." Adrian slipped the coin back into his pocket and walked toward the living room. Ethan looked up from the block tower, eyes searching his face. Adrian crouched down, steadying the base of the tower with one large hand. "Look strong," he said. Ethan tilted his head. It'll fall. Everything does. Adrian met his gaze, voice steady. Not this time. The boy didn't smile, but he didn't pull away either. In the quiet that followed, Adrian felt the storm inside him shift. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving loss, he was standing to protect life. The fire in the study had burned low, casting long shadows against the paneled walls. Adrian sat in the leather chair, the Coast Guard coin rolling between his fingers, its weight heavier tonight. Tessa's words lingered. Drummond plays for keeps. Upstairs, the boys finally slept. Their soft breathing carried through the baby monitor Elena had dug out of storage. Adrian stared at the flames, but all he saw was his brother's helicopter going down in a storm, Emily's name lighting up his phone while he chose the meeting instead. He whispered into the quiet, "I couldn't save them." The guilt dug its claws deeper as he thought about Ethan's eyes, those guarded eyes that never stopped scanning, waiting for disappointment. Adrian feared he wasn't strong enough to be the man those boys needed. Fatherhood wasn't meetings or logistics. It was showing up at every hour, in every storm, without flinching. Could he? Or would his grief drown him again? The coin slipped from his hand, clinking on the floor. He pressed both hands to his face, fighting the surge of memory. Emily's laugh at the Christmas market, Mark's teasing grin after every rescue. Gone, because he wasn't there. A knock at the doorframe startled him. Ethan stood barefoot in the hall, blanket trailing like a cape. His hair stuck up in sleep, but his eyes were wide awake. "You're loud," the boy muttered. Adrian blinked. "I'm sorry. Did I wake you?" Ethan shrugged, stepping inside. His gaze landed on the coin. "That's yours?" Adrian picked it up, brushing ash from its edge. "It was my brother's. He was in the Coast Guard." Ethan slid onto the rug, cross-legged. "Did he leave too?" The question pierced. Adrian's throat tightened. "He didn't want to. The storm. It took him." Ethan nodded slowly, as if cataloging another kind of leaving. He traced patterns on the rug with one finger. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Are you going to leave us too, when it gets hard?" Adrian's chest ached. Here it was, the raw fear that drove every guarded look, every whispered plea. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know if I'll be perfect. I've made mistakes, big ones. But I'm not walking away, Ethan. Not from you, not from Noah." The boy's eyes flickered, searching his face, testing for cracks. Finally, he gave the smallest nod, then curled onto the rug with his blanket, eyes half closing. Adrian covered him gently, the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than any deal he'd ever signed. This wasn't business. This was life, and if he failed, the damage couldn't be measured in dollars. He stayed there until Ethan's breathing evened, the coin warm in his fist again. For the first time in years, Adrian whispered a vow he intended to keep. "Not this time. I stay." Outside, the Atlantic thundered against the cliffs, but inside a fragile peace had begun to grow. Morning light cut pale stripes through the mansion's tall windows. For years, Adrian had risen to emails and conference calls, the rhythm of deals setting his day. Today, the rhythm was bottles warming on the stove, Noah's cries echoing down the hall, and Ethan dragging a chair across the kitchen tile to reach the cereal. Adrian stood awkwardly in his tailored shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, spoon in one hand, bottle in the other. Noah squirmed in his arm, tiny fists batting at the air. All right, Adrian muttered, fumbling with the cap. Milk dribbled onto the counter. Ethan watched, unimpressed. "You don't know how to do it." Adrian tried not to laugh. "I'm learning." The boy crossed his arms. "Mom does it one-handed, while stirring soup." Adrian glanced at him. "Your mom sounds remarkable." "She is," Ethan said firmly, the first true spark of pride Adrian had heard in his voice. Adrian handed the warmed bottle to Ethan, who adjusted it expertly in Noah's mouth. The toddler settled instantly, eyes closing in relief. Adrian felt a twinge, pride in Ethan's skill, shame in his own clumsy hands. He was a man who could command fleets and ports, but here he was a novice. Later that day, he sat in Judge Hendrick's chamber, a stack of emergency guardianship papers before him. His attorney leaned in. "It's temporary, Adrian, until the mother is located." Adrian signed without hesitation. "Temporary or not, they stay with me." The pen scratched across the page, sealing more than a legal promise. It sealed the shift of his life. When he returned home, Ethan was on the living room floor, building a fort from couch cushions, Noah giggling inside. The mansion, once sterile as a museum, now rang with small voices and clutter, socks abandoned by the fireplace, crayons scattered on the rug, a stuffed whale perched like a sentinel on the armchair. Adrian stood in the doorway, stunned at the transformation. It wasn't chaos, it was life. Ethan peeked out from the fort. "Where'd you go?" Adrian walked over, crouching low. "To make it official, you and Noah are staying here." The boy's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. "People say stuff. Doesn't mean it's true." Adrian reached into his pocket, pressing the Coast Guard coin into Ethan's palm. "This belonged to my brother. He never broke his word, and neither will I." Ethan turned the coin over, tracing the ridges with his thumb. For a moment he looked younger, less guarded. "What if we break stuff here?" Adrian smiled softly. "Then we clean it up together." That night, as a storm rattled the windows, Adrian sat awake between their rooms. Noah's soft snores through the baby monitor, Ethan's restless murmurs behind a cracked door. Every clap of thunder reminded him of loss, but every breath from the boys reminded him of why he stayed. For the first time since the crash, he felt the house shift. It wasn't a fortress anymore, it was becoming a home. The storm had eased into a steady drizzle, the cliffs shrouded in mist. Adrian sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, the boy stiff under the covers, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Trust was still a wall between them. Ethan's voice came small but sharp. "Rich people always say they care, then they send you away." Adrian's chest tightened. "Is that what you think I'll do? You have a big house, big company. You don't need us." Ethan's fists clenched under the blanket. "People like you never stay." Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out the navy and silver challenge coin. He turned it in the dim light until it caught Ethan's eye. "My brother carried this into every storm. He saved strangers without asking who they were. He'd tell me to listen to you, Ethan, to see you." The boy's gaze finally shifted, suspicious but curious. "Why would he care about me?" Adrian placed the coin gently on the nightstand. "Because he believed every life mattered, and so do I. I can't change the past, but I can promise you this. When you call, I answer. When you fall, I pick you up. I don't walk away." Silence stretched. Then Ethan rolled onto his side, eyes glistening. He whispered, "Nobody's ever stayed." Adrian leaned closer, his voice steady. "Then let me be the first." For a long moment, Ethan just stared at him, weighing the words against every betrayal he had known. Then, slowly, the boy shifted closer, resting his small head against Adrian's shoulder. The weight of that trust broke something open in Adrian, a wound he hadn't dared to touch since losing Mark and Emily. He wrapped an arm around Ethan, holding him with a care he didn't know he still had. The boy's breathing steadied, his body finally relaxing. Across the room, Noah stirred in his crib, murmuring softly before settling back into sleep. Adrian looked at the two brothers, then at the coin glinting by the lamp. The storm outside still beat against the windows, but inside, for the first time in years, Adrian felt a fragile peace. He whispered into the quiet, more vow than comfort. "You're my family now, and I will not fail you." Ethan's reply was barely audible, but it lodged deep in Adrian's heart. "Okay." The word was small, but it was everything. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Adrian had never known. His mornings used to begin with conference calls and market reports. Now, they began with Noah toddling into his study, clutching the whale plush by its ribbon, giggling as he called out, "Dada!" The first time he said it, Adrian nearly dropped his pen. At breakfast, Ethan remained cautious but less guarded. He built forts in the living room, stacking cushions into towers, sketching flags for the top. One afternoon, Adrian joined him, crawling through the blanket tunnels until Noah squealed with delight. When they emerged, flushed with laughter, Ethan handed Adrian a crayon drawing. 4 stick figures beneath a house with a bright red door. Across the top, in uneven letters, it read, "Home." Adrian studied the picture, his throat tight. "Is this us?" Ethan shrugged, feigning indifference. "Maybe. Don't lose it." Adrian didn't. He pinned it above the mantel, beside the framed photograph of his brother's helicopter. 2 symbols side by side, the past that had shaped him and the future daring to unfold. In the evenings, storms still swept the cliffs, rattling the windows. Adrian no longer sat alone in the silence. Instead, he read aloud while Noah fell asleep against his chest. Ethan curled at the foot of the couch, pretending not to listen. When thunder cracked, Ethan flinched, but Adrian's hand rested firm on his shoulder until he settled again. One night, Ethan asked softly, "Why do you stay up with us? You don't have to." Adrian answered without hesitation, "Because family means you don't face storms alone." The boy studied him for a long moment, then nodded. No words, but his eyes carried something new, trust flickering like the first light after a long blackout. The mansion itself transformed. Where once its halls echoed emptiness, now they bore the sounds of clattering toys, Noah's giggles, Ethan's cautious laughter. Even Elena remarked one morning, "It feels like someone opened the windows, sir. This house can finally breathe again." Adrian smiled faintly, but inside he knew it was more than the house. It was him, and yet he also knew the world beyond those walls was closing in. Rosa was still missing. Drummond's shadow stretched across the docks. And whispers in the media were starting to circle about the mysterious children living in a CEO's mansion. But for tonight, with Noah asleep in his arms and Ethan drawing quietly beside him, Adrian let himself believe in something he hadn't in years, that healing, though fragile, was possible. The headline landed on Adrian's desk with the morning papers. 2 abandoned boys found at CEO's estate. His stomach tightened. The article speculated on scandal, questioning whether Adrian Westcott, Portland's offshore wind magnate, was hiding a secret family. By noon, his assistant was calling about jittery investors and delayed contracts. At the mansion, Ethan caught sight of the folded paper on the counter. His face darkened. "They'll take us away now, won't they?" Adrian knelt, steadying his voice. "No, I signed guardianship. You're safe here. But the people on the boats, they'll know." Ethan's words shook. "They'll come." Adrian's chest burned. "Then they'll answer to me first." Yet, in the boardroom that afternoon, the pressure grew. A senior investor leaned across the polished table. "You're distracted, Adrian. Children in your mansion, rumors flying, permits delayed. If you don't stabilize, this empire collapses." Adrian sat straighter, the challenge coin in his pocket like an anchor. "My focus is exactly where it needs to be. A port can be rebuilt. A family can't." The investor scoffed. "We didn't back you for sentiment." Adrian's reply came calm, steady. "Then perhaps you backed the wrong man." That night, back at the mansion, Ethan hovered by the fireplace, staring at the framed crayon drawing of the red-doored house. "If they make you choose," he whispered, "you'll pick them, not us." Adrian crouched, gripping his shoulders gently. "Look at me, Ethan. I've already chosen. Every time." The boy's eyes shimmered, but he said nothing, curling into the blanket fort with Noah. Alone in the study, Adrian stared at his brother's coin, turning it over until his reflection blurred in the metal. The world demanded profits, headlines, numbers. But his heart knew the truth. These boys, their missing mother, their fragile trust. This was the tide worth fighting. And for the first time in his career, Adrian Westcott welcomed the storm. The press storm grew louder with each passing day, but Adrian refused to let it drown out what mattered. Instead of hiding, he stepped forward. At a press conference in the Windport terminal, cameras flashing, he stood tall in his Navy suit, the Coast Guard coin in his hand. "These boys aren't a scandal," he said firmly, voice carrying over the crowd. "They're survivors. And they deserve more than whispers." Reporters shouted questions. Adrian lifted the coin so its silver caught the light. "My brother flew into storms to save strangers. I'm honoring him by building something for families like theirs. Today, I pledge $10 million to launch Blue Harbor House, a shelter for exploited families along our coast." Gasps rippled. The announcement wasn't just charity, it was defiance. He cited Coast Guard reports, thousands trafficked each year along U.S. shores. His voice steady as he vowed to change that tide. Later, back at the mansion, Ethan sat at the table, crayons scattered, his eyes wide. "You told everyone?" Adrian crouched beside him. "Yes. The world needed to hear your story." Ethan frowned. "Won't that make them mad? The men with boats?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Then they know I'm watching, and I don't scare easy." For the first time, Ethan smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. He slid a paper across the table. On it, he'd drawn a house with waves below and a shining anchor above. "Blue Harbor," he said softly. Adrian's chest swelled. "That's exactly it." The next evening, Tessa arrived with news. "The FBI's moving. We've got Rosa's name on Drummond's payroll and witnesses placing her at the pier. They're planning a raid." Ethan froze at the word, clutching Noah's hand. "Will she come back?" Adrian knelt, his hand steady on the boy's shoulder. "She will. And when she does, she'll see the family you've built here, a family that stays." The storm outside crashed harder against the cliffs, but inside hope flickered like a lighthouse beam, cutting through the dark. The raid came at dawn, sirens cutting through the mist over Portland Harbor. Adrian stood on the pier beside Tessa, the salt air stinging his lungs, his heart pounding harder than any boardroom showdown. FBI agents poured into the cold storage compound, their shouts echoing against steel walls. Minutes felt like hours. Then, movement. A woman emerged, led gently by an agent. Her hair tangled, her coat torn. She clutched something small to her chest, a whale plush with a frayed blue ribbon. "Rosa Delgado," Tessa breathed. Adrian exhaled, his knees nearly giving way. He stepped forward as Rosa's eyes searched the crowd. Back at the mansion, Ethan and Noah waited by the fire. When Rosa entered, Noah squealed, toddling forward. She dropped to her knees, arms wide, tears streaking her face as she gathered both boys close. Ethan buried his face in her shoulder, his small frame shaking with sobs. Adrian stood back, giving them space. The challenge coin heavy in his pocket. He had kept his promise. For once, he hadn't been too late. Rosa looked up through her tears. You saved them. You saved me." Adrian shook his head softly. "They saved me." Ethan pulled free long enough to reach for a folded crayon drawing on the mantel. He pressed it into Adrian's hand. 4 stick figures beneath a red-doored house. Above them, in bold letters, "Home, because you stayed." Adrian's throat closed. He framed the drawing that night beside his brother's Coast Guard coin. One symbol of the man he lost, the other of the family he had finally found. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel like a monument to grief. It felt alive. Months later, the Westcott family returned to the harbor, The winter wind softened to a gentle coastal breeze. Adrian, Rosa, Ethan, and Noah walked together along the promenade, the Atlantic stretching endless and calm before them. The harbor reflected sunlight in silver ribbons, the memory of storms fading into the past. At a quiet corner, a newly dedicated bench awaited, engraved in polished wood. For those who stayed, the Westcott family. Adrian rested a hand on the back, feeling the smooth finish, the permanence of a promise kept. Ethan climbed onto the seat, Noah perched beside him, both pointing at the inscription with wide eyes. Rosa leaned on Adrian's shoulder. "You kept your word," she said softly. "All of you. And look at them. They finally feel safe." Adrian smiled, warm and real. The weight of grief finally lightened. He looked at Ethan and Noah, then at Rosa. "We stayed. That's what matters." The boys ran ahead, chasing seagulls, their laughter echoing against the harbor. Adrian followed, hand in hand with Rosa, the two of them no longer alone. He glanced down at the coin in his pocket, a reminder of Mark and the storms they'd both survived. And now, standing there with family at his side, Adrian understood something he had not in years. Courage wasn't just about facing the waves, it was about staying, through fear, loss, and uncertainty, for those who needed you most. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in golden pink, Adrian Westcott finally felt what it meant to belong. Not to wealth, not to work, not to the past, but to family. And for the first time in a long time, he was home.